The first thing that I learned was that when I was born, there was no Israel. It did not exist. There was Palestine, a region that had been around, of course, for many centuries, and that, so the question is, if Israel didn't exist when I was born, where did Israel come from, and where did this conflict come from? To answer that question, you don't go back 1,000 years or 2,000 years or whatever. You just go back to the late 1800s, and you find that Palestine was under the Ottoman Empire. It was a multicultural land, about 80% Muslim, 15% Christian, 5% Jewish, all living on the land, all practicing their religions fairly harmoniously, without significant conflict at all. So what happened to this land? You don't change places chronologically, but you do geographically. And you discover that if you go to Europe, there was a movement in Europe that started in the late 1800s called political Zionism that developed a wonderful shining slogan, a land without people for a people without land. Zionism, political Zionism in particular, was the belief that there needed to be a Jewish state somewhere in the world. They considered Uganda, Argentina, they considered parts of North America for the Jewish state, and eventually they settled on Palestine because of biblical connections from 2,000 years before. Now, if you'll think of that slogan, a land without people for a people without land, that I grew up with, it sounds wonderful. I think we would endorse that, except it was not a land without people. It was fully inhabited. One of the early Zionists that came wrote back to his family back in Europe about what he had found, Palestine. The simile was to a bride. And he said, I have seen the bride. She is beautiful, but she is married. So sadly, nevertheless, the immigration continued by Zionists to Palestine to create a Jewish state. And as we know, indigenous populations do not, especially over time, welcome their colonists with open arms, especially as the colonists increase in number and as it becomes clear that the intention is to dispossess 95% of the people who are already there. As a result, there was the tragic but predictable violence, with innocent lives lost then as now on both sides, then as now the vast majority of them, the Palestinian Christians and Muslims. The immigration continued and the violence continued over the decades, jumping ahead now to 1947. After World War II, the British had taken over the mandate from the Ottomans after World War I. After World War II, the British finally, with all the violence between the two groups and against the British Empire as well, decided to turn over the question of Palestine to the United Nations to solve. The United Nations at this point had the option of affirming a bedrock principle of democracy and of the United Nations itself, which was self-determination of peoples. Or they could revert to the medieval version where an entity, gives someone else's land away, divides it in half. Well, sadly, I believe for the world and for everyone, the United Nations, rather than affirming self-determination of peoples in which the people there would decide their own land, their own government, their own country, etc., they decided to recommend a partition plan in which half of it would be given to a Jewish state and half of it to a Palestinian Christian and Muslim state. Well, apart from it being coerced from an outside agency, not self-determination, let us examine this compromise solution to this conflict. Sometimes compromises are necessary, that's reality. But when you examine this one, you discover, first of all, it wasn't half, it wasn't 50-50. It was that one side was getting 55% and the other 45%. And the group that was getting 55% was not the group that had lived there for centuries and had originally been 95% of the population. It was the group, the newly arrived group. So the Jewish state was going to get 55%. To me, this made no sense. So I knew that there was a lot of immigration. It had increased in numbers over the years, especially under the Nazi atrocities. So I thought, well, maybe they had become 55% of the population, and perhaps it was a rational kind of compromise. Well, you look at the numbers, the immigration had caused a massive increase in population size, but it was still only 30%. So the group that was 30% was getting over half. That didn't make sense to me, so I wondered, well, perhaps it's land ownership. Land ownership could be a rational approach. This, in some cases, had been a well-funded immigration. The Rothschild banking family, in some cases, had funded some of these efforts. The intention had been to dispossess the people through just buying up all the land and pushing them that way. So maybe they had succeeded, and they owned 55% of the land. Well, the land ownership, the Jewish land ownership, had gone up significantly. Originally, it was around 1%. It was a very urban population. It had gone up to, at most, it appears, about 8%. Most historians say 5 to 6%. So a group that, let us say, owned 8% of the land was being given 55% of the land. I think, as history has shown us, the more inequitable, the more unjust a situation is, the more violence that results, not the reverse. So rather than leading to more peace, it led to more violence. And there was an outright war, the War of 47 to 49. This war is called in Israel the War of Independence. To Palestinians and most of the region, it's called the catastrophe, al-Nakba, because it was a massive humanitarian catastrophe in which at least 750,000 human beings, it's quite, the UN, I believe, or the British, some people say it was 800,000. It may have been even higher than that. At least 3/4, pretty much, of the entire Palestinian population was forced off their land, violently forced through extremely violent means, including a number of massacres. Much of this violence, and I believe half the massacres, occurred before Israel had even declared independence. So the myth, if any of you grew up with the myth of 5 Arab armies besieging little Israel, may not know that a great deal of the ethnic cleansing occurred before a single Arab army had joined the conflict, and that even once the Arab armies joined the conflict, the force of the Arab and Palestinian forces were smaller in number and in weaponry, considerably smaller than the Zionist Israeli forces were. So there was a massive, what the Israeli historian Ilan Pappé has called ethnic cleansing. That really is the accurate term for what happened. These refugees, according to international law and according to international morality, have the right to return home. But Israel does not allow them to return to their homes. So this is one of the key factors in the conflict today, and it's a factor the U.S. media almost never talks about, but it's significant. Again, jumping ahead to here's some of the massacres during this period. To 1967, we find that Israel attacked, at the end of that war, Israel had conquered 78% of Palestine, so the Palestinians were down to 22%. Then in 1967, Israel again attacked its neighbors, as it did in every single war except for one. And in this case, they conquered the West Bank, the Golan Heights, and the Gaza Strip. These are occupied territories. They are not part of Israel, except for Israel decided to annex the Golan Heights. The people there don't agree to that, but that's what Israel did. The West Bank and Gaza Strip are occupied territories. They are not part of Israel. They are Palestinian territories. During this period, by the way, Israeli forces, this was the Six-Day War, also attacked a U.S. Navy ship operating in international waters, the USS Liberty. They killed 34 American servicemen, injured 174 of them. The decks were running with blood. This was, according to Admiral Thomas Moore, a former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, this was an act of war by the State of Israel against the United States of America. And this was an act of murder against American servicemen. Again, according to Admiral Thomas Moore, testifying on Capitol Hill, I believe it was in 2003. I was there. Highly significant testimony, not reported in the American media. If you look on our website, you will see it's in the congressional record. An op-ed by Admiral Moore was in the Stars and Stripes newspaper, and the Associated Press uncharacteristically actually did a story about that. Nevertheless, do a LexisNexis search and you just don't find, something like 10 newspapers out of hundreds reported anything to do with it. Since 1967, by the way, taking land by conquest is no longer legal under international law in today's world. In addition, moving your population onto that land, confiscating private land, kicking the people out, and putting your own population on is illegal. There is no doubt about this. And yet that is what Israel has been doing since 1967. Every single one of those red dots is an illegal Israeli colony on Palestinian land. The red dots in Gaza have been removed as they were required to be removed by international law. So those are no longer there. Instead, Gaza is just largely a prison. Israel controls the borders, the airspace, etc. So it no longer has those red dots, it's just one big prison. But the West Bank now increasingly, while those settlers were taken out of Gaza, the amount of land taken in the West Bank increased significantly, and the number of settlers that moved onto that land increased significantly. That also was not reported by our media. So there is a lot of context that is extremely important to know that our news media aren't telling us. When I began to look into this, this was all new to me back in 2001. I had not known this was going on. When I began to look into it more and more, after several months, it seemed to me that this was so significant that it seemed to me that if what I was starting to learn was true, then it appeared that our national interests and needs as a nation were the opposite of what we were being told, and our moral responsibilities as human beings were the opposite of what the media were leading us to believe. It seemed so important that I finally decided to quit my job and to go and see for myself. And so began the most unusual trip I've ever undertaken. Many years before, I had been in the Peace Corps in Afghanistan. In that case, I was taught the language, I was married, and I had a very official support system behind me, the Peace Corps. In this case, I was going to be traveling alone, and I had no support system whatsoever of any kind. As I landed on February 7th at 8 p.m., my return flight scheduled for 1 month later, I experienced a sudden pang of the disquiet I had been trying to ignore. What was it going to be like for me, as an American female, to wander alone through a Muslim land that was in the middle of a violent uprising, and that was at the very epicenter of a region portrayed widely as extremely hostile to women in general and to Americans in particular? What was it going to be like? Well, as I wandered haphazardly and randomly throughout the Palestinian territories, throughout the West Bank and Gaza Strip, I discovered that once again, these are more myths about this region that are as untrue as they are widely held. I was welcomed and invited to stay in people's homes. I was treated with respect and completely safe, except when I came too near the Israeli military. I was welcomed whenever people heard that I was an American. The invariable response was welcome. And yet, this is what our media show us. Now they should. All of these pictures I'm showing you, I took myself, including these. This is what we see in our media that consistently reinforces Palestinians as terrorists, frightening images to us. If you look at this picture, sadly, I think I must have ruined the photograph that these photojournalists were taking because I was taking these pictures myself. This is a cardboard box that was being burned in what looks frightening in a funeral for a small boy who had been killed the day before. Now, yes, we should see these. I took them, I'm showing them to you. But it seems to me we should also see what most of the people looked like in that funeral. And this is what they looked like. This girl said to me, "Do you think we're all terrorists?" Because Palestinians know that's what Americans are led to believe about them. It seems to me we should see that there are, of course, still Christian Palestinians living there. You can meet them easily and ask them questions, as I did. I interviewed many, many people. That was my whole purpose of my trip. They all told me we are all Palestinians being pushed out by Israel. Muslims and Christians were just Palestinians. In this funeral, these were mixed. They're always mixed. Friends, friends working together, etc. This little boy, George, that was their son, he's holding a fragment of the missile that came through their home. His mother said he doesn't like his home anymore, and I understand why not. It's full of bullet holes. He's afraid to live there anymore.